Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
There's in the first part of this story. Wait for the second part. Stop, Samantha said, and they continued talking for several more hours. Ethan felt like he had known Samantha's parents all his life. Thea was the perfect hostess, never letting him go more than 10 minutes without food. Samantha didn't let Lana go all this time. Aunt Sam, do you want to look at my new dress? Certainly. Maybe you'll even take a photo of you in it. Lana took Samantha's hand and led her into the room. The family watched them as they went upstairs. I'm glad Samantha is making friends again, Samantha's father said. She's so happy, almost like the old days. Before Philia could continue, she stopped, noticing that Ethan was in the room. She hesitated, covering her mouth with her hand. Ethan looked around, noticing the confused faces around him. His brain was working feverishly before he spoke. Whatever happened, you don't need to tell me if you feel uncomfortable. The three present looked at each other. Samantha trusts you, her mother said quietly. That's enough for me. Ethan's curiosity increased. He took a bite of the cookie and continued listening. I just want you to know, Samantha's mother began, brushing away the first tears. Samantha may look carefree and cheerful, but she suffers inside. She's been through hell, and we know it. Remember this always when you are with her. Even if she doesn't talk about it, she experiences it every night. You really like her, Thea added. We thought you would never be able to trust a man again. But for your sake, she's trying to suppress her fears. Try not to offend her, okay? What happened to her? Thea looked first at Samantha's mother, then at her father, and then back at Ethan, pursing her lips. Finally, she spoke. Sorry, but I can't tell you this. She will never forgive me. Perhaps someday, she will tell you everything herself. There was an awkward pause before Samantha returned with her niece and a stack of photographs. Everyone said their goodbyes, and Ethan led Samantha out. He looked at her, hiding the weight of the secret behind a calm smile. Suddenly, he hugged her tightly for no reason. She pulled back slightly and looked at him with a smile. How much wine did you drink while I was away? He just smiled and helped her into the car. They drove back to the city. Ethan stepped outside his house and rose to the roof. He began to look at the starry sky above him. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, seeing a familiar number that he didn't want to talk to, but his heart reached out to the bell. The whole day had been dedicated to the importance of family, and it left a pleasant aftertaste. He answered. You finally answered. Hi, Val, he said. It's a wonderful night, isn't it? Yes, you're so hard to get, Val responded. For the last 10 years, I've gotten one boring call on my birthday and Christmas. That's it. You can imagine my surprise when you called. It was a moment of weakness. I just saw so many people die from pill. Then I realized that I had to move on. Do I need your moment of weakness so that you call me? It's sad, you know. How many times have I tried to call you since then? I know, but I'm sorry. I couldn't bring myself to answer. Valeria was silent for a moment. Why? She asked sincerely. What did I do to deserve losing you? You know what? He sighed. And you know I don't want to talk about it. No, a voice sounded from the other end of the line with pressure. This Cold War between us has dragged on long enough. Today it will end. Whatever you want to say it, and we'll begin to repair our relationship. Not now, Val. I'm not ready. Now is the time. You're mad at me. I understand that. Scream, swear, throw out everything that has accumulated. I won't end this call until you do. Please, Val, he said in a trembling voice. Please don't. I want my little brother back, the one who was once my best friend. And damn it, I'll do whatever it takes. Ethan didn't say anything. Bitterness rose in his throat. Everything you've ever wanted to tell me. Now's your chance. Don't keep it to yourself. He searched his mind for the right words to express the many feelings he was experiencing. There was a short pause before he began slowly, but with intensity. Valeria Cole, you no longer have a brother. Never. Ever. Do you remember all those times your dad came home drunk and was about to hit you? I stood in his way until you locked yourself in your room, and he only hit me. Do you remember how I protected you? I remember. Do you remember how I stood up for you when you admitted to Mom and Dad that you were gay? I remember. He paused to catch his breath, a few tears leaking through his defenses. 10 years of suppressed rage and frustration had finally reached their boiling point. All of it burst out, regardless of his desire. The one time I wanted you to stand up for me, the one time I needed your support, you weren't there. Dad told me not to marry Zoe, and you took his side. You said it was because we were too young, but in reality, it was because you didn't want to stand up to Dad. His voice began to shake, but he was determined to continue. Mom couldn't protect me anymore, and I needed my older sister. I begged and cried for my big sister to be there, but she wasn't. He cried bitterly into the phone. Large tears flowed down his cheeks onto the concrete floor. His vision became too blurry to make out individual stars. "Are you finished?" Valeria asked softly. Ethan pressed the end call button and slowly walked back to his apartment. He would never admit it, but he felt lighter than he had in years. Mount Si is a world-renowned hospital. Ethan was in awe of what he saw. Cutting-edge equipment, state-of-the-art labs, and some of the best medical teams to learn from. Unfortunately, one thing that remained the same was the need for weekly shifts in the emergency department. He stood in his white miracle worker uniform, deftly dodging yet another woman who claimed to have a skin disease down there that he simply had to feel. His phone rang, and he answered. "Hello? Sam? Yes, I'm almost done with the last patient of the year. The film festival starts in 10 minutes. She answered irritably. "Sorry, take a seat for me." "Okay, I'll call you when I'm in Tribeca, and you can ask security to let me through." There was an irritated sigh, and the call ended. Ethan cursed from the bottom of his heart at whoever came up with the shifts in the emergency room. He headed to the next room behind the screen. "So what?" The words died in his throat. His legs felt weak, and his stomach felt like a sledgehammer had hit him. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His head began to spin, and he felt disoriented. Sitting on the bed with a nasty bruise on her face and a bleeding lip was the woman who had once been known as Zoe Morno-Cole. She looked up, opening her swollen eyes slightly to look at him. Ethan opened her medical file, determined to maintain professionalism. He was determined to show that she no longer had power over him. Mrs. Morno, she had decided to keep her maiden name. She smiled as much as her swollen lips would allow. "What happened to you, Mrs. Morno?" "The bathroom floor was wet, and I slipped. I hit my face on the edge of the bathtub. It was a stupid accident." Ethan knew that this was an obvious lie, but he continued to maintain forced professionalism. He carefully felt the damaged areas for pain, his fingers lingering a little longer on her lips. "Are you sure this happened in the bathroom?" "Yes," she insisted. "Please, it's not what you think." "Okay," he said, "it looks like you have a fractured cheekbone. The orderly will take you for an x-ray." Still maintaining his cool, calm demeanor, he made several notes. He had no intention of showing weakness. He wasn't going to show Zoe what she had done to him. "After the x-ray, tell the orderly to take you to my office. Depending on the extent of the damage, I will prescribe pain medication for you." Ethan wrote a referral for an x-ray and tore the paper off the pad. "I'll go get the orderly." Before he could leave, she grabbed his hand. It wasn't strong, but the grip was like a vice. He couldn't move. His mind flashed back to the times when her gentle touch had made his life much less miserable. For 10 years, he quietly closed the screen completely and turned to face her. "Sorry," she said through swollen lips. "Excuse me, I didn't know you were at Mount Si. I wouldn't have come if I had known." Zoe let go of his hand, and it sank limply along her body. She tried to smile as best as she could. "What do you want?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied. "I don't have any plans. I've already caused you enough pain. I'm not going to be the reason for more. You don't have to treat me like this, Ethan. Whether you like it or not, I have to. Today, I'm in charge of the reception department." Her good eye ran over his figure from top to bottom. "You look good, Ethan. Much better than I remember." "Zoe, are you sure these bruises appeared after falling in the bathroom?" "You lie, and you do it badly." "Yes," she begged. "I don't care what you think. This is exactly what happened. Did your husband do this to you? You know that I have to file a police report if I suspect that he did this. Please, I beg you, don't do this. Don't make my life any more difficult." He handed her a handkerchief so she could wipe away a few tears. "You must be feeling avenged right now," she whispered. "I left you and got what I deserved." "No," he said softly. "I never wanted this for you. No matter what you did, I never wished you pain. But even as he said this, Ethan felt a sweet sense of gloating inside. It would be a lie to say that he didn't feel the slightest satisfaction. This was human nature. I believe you, Ethan. You are the best person I've ever met. Our breakup tore me up inside, just like I think it did to you. And yet, you continued with it no matter what. Then divorce him. Free yourself again. This isn't the first time for you. He spat bitterly. It took him several deep breaths to regain his calm. Sorry, I didn't mean to say it like that, he added. It doesn't matter. It's my fault. I left the most wonderful person in the world for a stupid dream of wealth. I deserve everything I get. Do you think that putting up with your husband beating you is a punishment? Do you think you're punishing yourself for breaking up with me? Ethan said coldly. This is nothing compared to what I went through after you left me. You broke my heart into a million pieces. Nothing you do for yourself will compare to this. With those words, he went out to call the orderly. He never looked back at Zoe. An hour later, he was in his apartment, curled up next to a bottle of whiskey. All the memories he had so carefully locked away came flooding back to him. The clearer they seemed, the more painful they became. He walked over to the chest of drawers and opened the top drawer. Among the clothes lay a jewelry box. With trembling fingers, he opened it and saw a gold medallion on a chain. He opened it and saw two tiny portraits, him and Zoe. A strangled sob caught in his throat. Ethan realized that he couldn't let go of the past. I can't believe you missed the film festival yesterday. It took so much effort to get tickets. Ethan didn't answer. They were sitting in Mario's restaurant, preparing to enjoy the best tagliatelle and ragu in Manhattan. But his mind was far away. Samantha looked at him, narrowing her eyes. Finally, she snapped her fingers in front of his face to regain his attention. Sorry, he muttered. What's wrong with you? Samantha asked insistently. You said almost nothing today. I was just thinking about work, he said, waving it off. You're lying, Samantha said, wiping her mouth with a napkin. Ethan looked at his food, which remained untouched, suddenly losing his appetite. What can you tell me? She asked sincerely, taking his hand. I won't judge. You know that. He began frantically, trying to find an excuse. Finally, he gave in and put down the cutlery. Zoe came to the emergency department yesterday, he said briefly. He told her about their meeting as briefly and as painlessly as possible. Her eyes widened with each subsequent sentence, and she squeezed his hand tightly. It took him the longest 10 minutes of his life to tell her. Is that all? She asked. Ethan nodded. You should tell the police. I can't, he said calmly. She begged me not to do this and said that she would refuse to testify. I have no absolute proof that her husband did this. So you're just going to watch her get beaten up? Is that the kind of person you are? He didn't know what to answer. He really wanted to find the right words. I know you, Ethan. If you don't do anything, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Who said that I won't regret it if I do? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Don't frown like that. It's just for a month. Ethan opened the door for Samantha and her luggage. She was flying to Hong Kong to cover the final days of the student protests. He walked her to the terminal entrance at JFK and waited while she pulled out her documents for inspection. She glanced at him, noticing the familiar sadness she had been trying to rid him of. Suddenly, she hugged him tightly and kissed him on the cheek. He'll be back as soon as possible. I promise. They said their goodbyes, and Ethan returned to his apartment. It was still early, and he needed to get ready for work. Everything happened as if by inertia. He prepared himself a minimal breakfast and went outside. Everything remained the same, but something was different. He didn't realize how much he would miss Samantha. Dr. Cole, there's a woman waiting in front of your office. She's been here for quite some time. Ethan saw Zoe sitting on the couch. She was dressed simply, and there were almost no bruises on her face. She almost resembled the woman he had once fallen in love with 10 years ago. Come in, he invited her. Glad to see you're recovering, he said. Ethan, I want you to stop protecting me. I already told you I'm not going to apply. Yesterday, 2 police officers came to my house and asked if I had been abused. I had to listen to them for over an hour, and they looked at me like I was a typical woman who refuses to testify against her husband. The irony of this phrase hung in the air. I had to get them out before Milo returned from work. If he had seen them, things would have gotten much worse. Do you hear yourself? Ethan said, slamming his fist on the table. You're afraid of him and still don't want to testify? Zoe recoiled in fear, her eyes flashing. A nearby nurse knocked on the door to make sure everything was okay. Ethan lied and sent her back, then turned back to his ex-wife. I don't have time for this now. Then he'll wait downstairs like before. My shift has just started. Are you planning to wait 8 hours? This has never been a problem before. She smiled, standing up. For the rest of the day, Ethan seemed to wander in a fog. He moved from one patient to another, unable to concentrate. His documentation was clearly incomplete, and he sat silently at a case conference where he was asked to speak. 6 p.m. couldn't come fast enough. As promised, Zoe waited patiently in the hospital lobby. She stood up and followed him outside. They went to the nearest cafe and sat down at a table. Does your husband know you're here? Milo? He's in Edison now, meeting with a client. Meeting with a client? Isn't he an investment banker? His company was one of the largest in the city. One day, he made a huge investment in a company whose shares plummeted. He lost his job, and we lost everything. House, cars, everything. He's been taking orders locally ever since. Zoe looked at him, then at her cup. The first few months were like a fairy tale. We got married in Monaco and spent our honeymoon in Milan. Every day was a new adventure. We flew to Key West, St. Moritz, and Tallinn in the same week. Sounds like a dream, Ethan said, taking a sip of espresso. Zoe plunged into memories with a smile. You probably won't believe it, but even in those days, I often thought about you. I constantly thought about the pain I caused you. It was so unfair. Sometimes I dreamed of returning everything back, but I was afraid to do it. What happened to him after the collapse? Milo took it to heart. He started drinking every day. The money I earned wasn't enough to support his usual lifestyle. We sold the house to pay off his debts and moved into the slums. It was all we could afford. Ethan began pointing at her face. Zoe nodded sadly. At first, it was out of disappointment that he couldn't find a permanent job. Then, because there wasn't enough money for drinks. Then, because he made the wrong bet. He always needed to find a reason. I became the most convenient target. Despite all this, do you want to sue him or leave him? No, she sobbed. He is my husband. I promise to be with him until death do us part. I think you're taking that part of the oath too literally, he replied dryly. After all, you made the same promises to me, and it wasn't difficult for you to throw them away. Don't say that, she pleaded. For 10 years, you had my undivided and deep love. If it means something to you, please don't say it. Ethan quietly continued drinking his coffee. Milo is all I have left. I can't leave him. You have more. He began immediately, but stopped without finishing. Zoe quickly looked into his eyes with her piercing gaze that once made his heart flutter. Who else do I have? Is it you? No, he said. This is not me, and will never be me again. I won't take you back after what you did. Every time I see you, I only think about you and Milo in that damn hotel. Nothing will change that. I miss you so much. It hurts, Ethan, she whispered. He felt the old desire for her love awaken in him. All those feelings he had tried so hard to bury came rushing back to life, demanding only one thing, to hug her and kiss her. Then a vivid memory flashed in his mind, a restaurant almost a year ago. Every detail was etched into his memory. The rain, the drink, the designer dress, the laughter, and that fateful kiss. The memory hit him like a punch to the stomach. Silently, he finished his coffee. Stop fooling yourself, Zoe. It's not me you miss. It's the exotic vacations and sports cars. The remains of her coffee spilled onto the table as she quickly stood and headed for the exit, suppressing sobs. A few seconds later, she was already on the street, and Ethan caught a glimpse of her tearful face as she ran past the glass window of the cafe. Please, let me in. Ethan left the half-empty bottle and glanced at the door. Through the peephole, he saw Zoe standing on the threshold, an expression of mortal fear on her face. He opened the door, and she staggered inside, clutching her arms tightly. Sorry for coming here, Ethan. I didn't know where else to go. What's happened? Milo lost his job and drank too much. He was furious, such fury as I've never seen before. He threw bottles, plates, anything he could get his hands on. I ran away, and he chased me for a while until I got on the bus. I can't go home tonight. He'll kill me, I swear. How did you find out where I live? I found your business card in the reception department. She answered, breathing heavily. Can I stay here for the night? In the morning, when he sobers up, I'll go back home. Of course, he replied, without thinking it through. I'll cook dinner. Let me, Zoe offered. She opened the refrigerator and selected a few ingredients. The scene reminded Ethan of his past life. So much had changed since the last time she cooked for him. Please, Zoe, for God's sake, sue him. You continue to suffer for nothing. I've already forgiven you for everything. There's no need to torture yourself anymore. Why sue? Because he drank and broke a few plates? This will only make him even angrier. Zoe focused all her energy on cooking the chicken perfectly. For a moment, she seemed lost between layers of reality. All that mattered was cooking dinner for Ethan. She forgot about unpaid bills, her abusive husband, and broken dreams. They ate in silence. Zoe was especially hungry, and Ethan relished a home-cooked meal for the first time in months. After dinner, she broke the silence. Ethan, I want to ask you for one thing, just one thing. I want you to sleep with me tonight. I miss your kisses, your touch, your words. Please, let me be your wife for just one night. He looked at her, startled by her request. She wiped the tears from her eyes and added, I cheated on you with Milo. It's only fair that I do this to him. Two wrongs don't make a right, Zoe. They never did. Before he could turn away, she let her dress fall to the floor. His gaze involuntarily stopped at her body, covered only in thin underwear. Scars and cuts were visible on her torso, in various stages of healing. What did he do to you? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Slowly, he walked over to her, holding her by the waist and guiding her to the bed. His lips touched her stomach as he began to kiss along the stretched skin. He kissed all her wounds, each one tearing at his soul. Please, Ethan, I need this, she made a sound moving beneath him. So much time has passed, she said softly. Ethan thought the same. He looked at her familiar body, the one he once knew so well. Gradually, she returned to his arms, feeling his warm hands holding her close against his bare chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. It took all her strength not to burst into tears on his shoulder. Quietly, she fell into a deep sleep. The morning light filtered through the windows and played across her face. She stirred, trying to cling to her dream world. The body holding her shifted gently, laying her back down on the bed. It's morning, Zoe, Ethan said softly. I know. Let me sleep a little longer, and then I'll go. I promise. Stay for breakfast. It'll be nice to finally eat something proper, not streetcar food. As you say, she muttered, not opening her eyes. Simple eggs, bacon, and toast had never tasted so good. They ate in silence until Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. Zoe, please, sue Milo. I've already forgiven you for what you did. You don't have to suffer anymore. Get rid of him. She set her knife and fork down and took a deep breath. Ethan, I'll ask you one question. If I leave Milo, will you marry me again? Can you find it in yourself to take me back? He didn't answer immediately. Zoe stared at him, waiting until finally he spoke. I'm sorry, Zoe, but I can't. I'll love you forever, but I won't be able to trust you again. She reached across the table and took his hand. I don't blame you, Ethan. What I did deserves the most severe punishment. If that punishment is staying married to Milo Petrick, so be it. But I said I forgive you. Zoe looked at him, her face full of sorrow and regret. I never said I forgive myself. Did she come to your house last night? Samantha's voice cut through the haze of Ethan's groggy mind. She looked visibly unhappy, even though she was over 8,000 miles away via FaceTime. Ethan rubbed his eyes, still not fully awake, and nodded. What happened? Samantha asked. She was looking for shelter from her husband for one night. She cooked us dinner, and we went to bed. He deliberately left out what happened after that. Samantha stared at him for a few seconds, then rolled over and held the phone above her so he could see her face from above. I have to go to lunch with some local journalists, but he'll contact you later. You can count on it. She hung up, and Ethan spent the next hour scrolling through her Instagram photos. Samantha's feed was full of pictures from the protests and the impressive Hong Kong skyline and pier. He lingered on a selfie where her face was partially obscured by the rising sun over the coast. Her blonde hair fluttered in the wind, and the sunlight formed a golden halo around her head. Her smile was constant in every photo. He closed the app and crawled back under the covers. He missed that smile more than he thought he would. The next day, Ethan couldn't focus at work. Every new patient seemed like Zoe to him. He hadn't heard from her, didn't know if she was okay or even alive. Zoe still had a firm hold on his heart, and he needed to know how she was. From time to time, he talked to Samantha, grateful for the minutes she spared between her work. She listened carefully and reassured him that it was okay to worry about someone you once loved. Sometimes he talked for the entire conversation while she just nodded and listened. It gave him more comfort than he'd imagined possible. He began visiting old haunts, coffee shops, diners, shopping malls. Physically, he was there, but his soul was somewhere far away. One day, he passed through Washington Square Park and stopped, remembering their first date, if it could even be called that. A street artist was painting a realistic crack in the asphalt, and a crowd had gathered around to watch and take photos. "Hello." Ethan turned to see the cheerful young artist who had once painted him and Samantha. She was wearing a simple jumpsuit and a beret. "Your girlfriend's not with you this time?" she asked. "No, she's in Hong Kong for work." "That's a pity," she said with a pout. "How about a solo portrait? I'm great at singles." "Why not?" Clapping her hands with delight, she led him deeper into the park and sat him near the fountain. She smoothed his hair and adjusted his head so the evening sun lit his face just right. "That's it. Hold this pose." Ethan tried to stay still as the artist worked, her brush moving quickly over the canvas. Occasionally, she stepped back to memorize a few details before returning to the painting. "Are you serious with her?" she asked while detailing his stubble and eyes. "It's complicated." She finished with a flourish and stood back to admire her work. "Here, look." This time, the painting looked lighter, happier. Ethan seemed more like his old self. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, pulling out his wallet. Before paying, he snapped a photo of the painting and sent it to Samantha. When Ethan finally returned home, he found Zoe waiting for him at his door. She looked tired, leaning against the wall as if she'd been standing there for hours. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked. "A few hours," she replied with a smile. "No problem. I just wanted to see when you got back." "Where's your husband?" "Milo? He's in Syracuse, trying to get a temporary job at his friend's agency." Ethan carefully studied her from head to toe. She opened her coat, revealing that she wasn't wearing much underneath. Her gaze made her intentions clear. "So, you're going to cheat on your husband again?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet contempt. "At least this time, it'll be with someone I love," she replied bitterly, but with a faint smile. He almost laughed at her words. Her face was as gloomy and devastated as he'd seen it since she had first come to the emergency room. The only time it had been different was when they were intimate. Ethan swore, cursing his weakness in front of her. He could not deny. He was utterly unable to deny her. That one drop of light that might, for even a moment, illuminate her dark and gloomy life. Without another word, he opened the door and let her in. More bruises covered her body, but Ethan's eyes were drawn to hers. Those eyes still held the same spark of passion and pain he knew too well. Moments later, he was lying in bed. Zoe smiled blissfully. "Let's stay like this a little longer." "Zoe, please," Ethan whispered. "I'll do anything you want. Just leave your husband. I forgive you for everything. You don't have to suffer anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Zoe lifted her head and gazed at him, her eyes searching his face as if waiting for him to say more. When he didn't, she smiled sadly and kissed him again. "Don't say things you don't mean, Ethan. Please at least disrespect me. Don't hurt yourself trying to save me. I can't be saved anymore." "No, don't say that," he pleaded. "I still love you." "I love you too, more than you can imagine," she said, her voice trembling. "And that's why I can't let you take me back. I can't live with myself, seeing the pain in your eyes every time you look at me. You'll try to hide it, try to pretend everything's fine for my sake, but I know you too well. You'll die inside." Ethan stared at her, his mouth open, unable to respond. Zoe glanced at the clock on the bedside table. "It's time for me to leave." Milo will be back soon. Ethan felt a deep, unspoken pain, but couldn't find the words to stop her. Same time tomorrow? She asked before saying goodbye. She broke his heart again, like a child's dream shattered, and discarded their marriage like spoiled leftovers. Ethan knew all this. He remembered every painful detail, as if a broken record replayed the same scenes over and over in his head. But why did it still sting so much to see her in such a degraded state? Why did his heart ache at the thought of her bruises, welts, and scars? Why did he let her into his apartment, into his bed, over and over again? The answer lay where it always had, in a velvet box locked in a drawer of his closet. Inside was a beautiful gold medallion containing 2 photos from their past. Every night when Zoe wasn't there, Ethan would open it and gaze at his little time machine, telling his story to a bottle of scotch. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan and Zoe continued their sporadic trysts. The encounters satisfied them physically, but lacked the spark of their marriage. It all happened at his apartment, their shared secret. Then came the day he saw her at Mount Si Hospital. Ethan was on an extended shift, taking a break near the emergency room entrance when she appeared. Something was wrong. Her face was pale, her movements frantic. She ran in, shouting for a doctor. An attendant stopped her, but Ethan intervened and pulled her aside. "What's happened?" he asked. "Milo got into a bar fight," she said, her voice shaking. "He's badly injured." "Where is he?" "They're bringing him in an ambulance." "Please, Ethan, you have to save him." He rushed to the ambulance bay, just as the paramedics were unloading a gurney. Spotting one of them, Ethan called out, "How bad is it?" "Very bad," the paramedic replied. "Fractures to the neck, ribs, and pelvis. Extensive internal bleeding. We barely got him here in time." Ethan shouted instructions to the orderlies. "Prepare him for emergency surgery. Tell Dr. Jorgensen to assemble a team. Find his blood type and get 5 units from the bank immediately." Even as he ran, his mind raced. The team had already gathered and begun changing into sterile gowns by the time he arrived. Ethan joined them, double-checking his gear to ensure complete sterility. Through the glass doors of the operating room, he saw Zoe standing in the waiting area, tears streaming down her face. The sight burned a hole in his heart. Despite everything that had happened, it was still unbearable to see her cry. But now wasn't the time for distractions. He steeled himself, his determination unwavering, and entered the operating room. Milo Petrick was just another patient who needed his help. Zoe sat in the waiting room, her eyes glued to the clock. Seconds turned into minutes, minutes into hours. Each tick was a fresh torment as she waited in painful uncertainty for news of her husband's fate. People came and went, their footsteps briefly raising her hopes. It was past 2 a.m. when the operating room doors finally opened. Ethan emerged, still in his surgical gown. His hands and the front of his robe were smeared with blood. Exhaustion etched deep lines on his face, and he leaned against the wall for support. Zoe approached him softly, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. Ethan turned his tired eyes to her and shook his head. "I'm really sorry. We did everything we could." His ribs were completely shattered, and bone fragments pierced his lungs, kidneys, liver, and heart. He also suffered a severe blow to the head and was nearly brain dead when he arrived. There was nothing we could do. The sound of a dull thud echoed as Zoe's eyes closed and her knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor. Ethan immediately knelt beside her, cradling her head in his hands as doctors and nurses rushed to surround them. Ethan spent the night at the hospital, ensuring Zoe was moved to a private room. She was sedated with sleeping pills, partly because Ethan couldn't bear to see her awake, grieving, and inconsolable. The next day passed in a blur of bodies, paperwork, and endless meetings. It was evening when the head doctor insisted that Ethan go home and get some rest. His legs felt like lead as he dragged himself out of the hospital. The events of the previous night haunted him, Milo Petrick's face appearing before his eyes for the 3rd time. The first 2 were during Zoe's affair with him. Back then, Ethan often fantasized about what he'd like to do to Milo, how he might punish him. For the briefest of moments, he even considered acting on those thoughts. But fantasies were cheap. When he saw Milo's mutilated body on the operating table, all those thoughts vanished. His blood froze. Milo's face was barely recognizable from the beating he had endured. It was a fate Ethan wouldn't wish on his worst enemy, not even Milo Petrick. Ethan needed a distraction from the horror of the previous evening, someone who could understand him. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number that had recently returned to his speed dial. "This is a surprise," said Valerie. "From you calling endlessly until I pick up, to you now calling me yourself. To what do I owe the honor?" "Very funny, Val," Ethan replied, managing a small smile. "I just wanted to know how you're doing. Let me guess. One of your patients died, and you're having a moment of weakness, so you decided to call me. Am I right?" Ethan smiled faintly. His sister had always been uncannily perceptive. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. "Well," she continued, "you've come to the right place. I have an idea to distract you from all this. How about you visit us sometime? Stop by Greenville. I mean, does it sound that terrible? You spent 2/3 of your life here. It can't be that bad. What, so you and Father can gloat about how my marriage fell apart like you predicted from the start? No thanks, Ethan," Valerie said, her tone growing serious. "Nobody is going to say that. I know you don't like us, but we haven't seen you in 10 damn years." Ethan paused, letting his tired brain process her words. Valerie continued, "Father misses you too. He even asked me to persuade you to visit. He's too afraid to ask you himself." "Father wants me to come?" Ethan chuckled bitterly. "What happened? Did he lose his punching bag?" "Ethan," Valerie snapped, "no matter what happened, he's still our father, and you will not talk about him like that. Are you seriously defending him? After everything he's done?" "Yes," Valerie said firmly. "I've told you before, and I'll tell you again. He's not the man you remember. Since Mom died and you left, he's been going to anger management classes and AA meetings. Next month will mark 5 years of sobriety." "If you say so," Ethan replied skeptically. "One thing I've never done is lie to you, and I'm not starting now. I've said my piece. Now I can only hope you'll be the bigger person." The call ended. Ethan stood up from the bench near the ambulance bay. Zoe's tear-streaked face and Milo's battered one flashed in his mind. It felt unfair. Milo could still influence him, even in death. As Ethan walked out of the hospital, he spotted Samantha waiting for him with 2 mocha lattes and a big smile. "Did you miss me?" she teased. A sudden rush of emotion overcame Ethan, and he hugged her tightly. Samantha barely managed to keep her coffee from spilling on the sidewalk. "More than I can tell you," Ethan murmured. "I've never seen him like this," Samantha said later, taking a drag from her joint. "Is it true?" Damien asked, raising an eyebrow. "He just sat there and cried," Samantha continued, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He told me about his ex-wife and her husband. It was painful to watch, but now it's all in the past, and that's what matters." "Hardly," she added, exhaling smoke at the ceiling. Damien looked at her sharply. "You think he's still holding on to his ex?" "I'm sure of it. They probably slept together while I was away." "Did he tell you that?" "No, but he's a terrible liar, especially with me. I could tell the first time we talked on FaceTime." "And you didn't bring it up?" Damien asked, surprised. "It's none of my business," Samantha replied, blowing out another cloud of smoke. "It's not like I'm his girlfriend or anything." A long pause followed. Damien broke the silence. "And whose fault is that? You're in love with him. Only I know it." "He's still going through a divorce," she said defensively. "I don't think it's the right time to impose on him." She didn't have time to finish her thought. Damien interrupted her, his voice full of frustration. "It's clear you think the best option is to let him pine endlessly for his ex-wife. You and I both know I'm not suitable for the role of a girlfriend," Samantha said, brushing away the smoke that obscured her face. "God, how many years has it been since I even allowed a man to touch me? Just touch me? You didn't choose what happened to you," Damien replied gently. "You don't have to carry this burden for the rest of your life." "But it happened," Samantha blurted out. "You can't deny it, and you can't pretend it didn't. I'm broken, Damien, and we both know it. Ethan deserves someone better, someone like my old self." Damien leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "Then become her again. Show Ethan the Samantha Pendergast who loved life more than anyone I know. I'm trying, damn it. She snapped. All these psychiatrists keep telling me I need to accept what happened and move on. Like it's so simple. It's as if none of them have ever been locked in a room for days on end. You don't just get over it. You survive, but you don't really move past it. You're still in that room, aren't you? Damien said quietly. It's your personal prison. If you stay there, they win. They broke you, yes, but you can't let that be the end of your story. You have to move on, Sam. You know I've always wanted the best for you. Samantha looked away, her voice softer. I know. Ethan has enough problems of his own, she muttered. He does, Damien agreed. But he's stuck in his own limbo, just like you. He needs you, Sam. And whether you admit it or not, you need him. You two are the only ones who can truly understand what the other is going through. Trust him, for both your sakes. They smoked in silence for several minutes before Samantha spoke again. You're a great therapist when you're high, you know? Damien smirked. Even so, you'll find the right words someday. And when you do, they'll be simple. Okay, wise sage, she teased, putting an arm around his shoulders to help him up. Let's get you to bed. Thank you, Damien. I really needed to hear this. You're an amazing person, she said as she tucked him in. Damien muttered sleepily. Now go tell that to Ethan and stop being as hopeless a liar as he is. Samantha chuckled softly and stayed by his bedside until he fell asleep. The next day, Ethan remained lost in thought. The events of the past 24 hours had aged him several years. Sleepless and weary, he sat staring at an empty wall in his office. A pile of documents waited on his desk, but he couldn't bring himself to start working. A knock on the door broke his trance. Miss Pendergast is here to see you, a voice announced. Let her in. Samantha walked in and sat across from him, a small mountain of papers between them. Sorry about the mess, Ethan said without looking up. It's all work. How's Zoe? Samantha asked, her voice full of genuine concern. She was discharged this morning. She said she needed time to think things over and make funeral arrangements for her husband. I don't know where she is now. Do you need some time alone? Samantha asked. I can come back later. No, please stay, Ethan replied quickly. Talking to you yesterday really helped. How about you and I take a break from all this? Samantha suggested. You probably have some vacation days saved up. To her surprise, Ethan didn't reject the idea outright, as he might have in the past. He barely nodded but didn't resist. Why not? He reasoned. There wasn't much left to destroy in his life, but rebuilding one important bridge in particular felt like the right thing to do. So they planned a road trip to his hometown of Greenville. As they drove, Samantha gazed out at the rows of houses along the main road. So this is where you grew up? She asked. We're not actually in the town yet. Ethan replied, gesturing out the window. But yeah, that's my old school. Looks like they finally repaired it. Samantha raised her camera and snapped a quick photo. The small suburban-style houses were a welcome change from the city's endless rows of apartment complexes. I have to admit, this is not at all what I pictured when you said small-town upstate, she said, smiling. Damn, I wish there was a department store like this in Soho, Sam said, glancing at the lively shops as they drove past. Believe me, 10 years ago, it was just an ordinary small town. What happened? Did someone find gold? Sam teased, laughing. No, Ethan chuckled. But my sister decided to take every small family business here to the next level. Now people come from neighboring cities to shop. Your sister? Are you close to her? We haven't seen each other in 10 years. I didn't come to Greenville, and she never stopped by to see me when she was in town. A couple of awkward calls a year. That's the extent of our relationship. Wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. We quarreled over Zoya, and it's been that way ever since. Val and I used to be really close, Ethan admitted. Do your parents live here too? Sam asked gently. Ethan rarely talked about his family, and Samantha had never pressed him about it. But now he seemed different, more open. My father does. One of the main reasons my sister stays here is to take care of him. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 17. Sam glanced at him with compassion, but said nothing, sensing that silence was the best response. She took a few more photos as Ethan turned the car into a gravel driveway leading to a large gray two-story house. Its fresh paint and well-maintained appearance made it stand out from the surrounding homes. Ethan turned off the engine and froze. Sam noticed him taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. Instinctively, she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "One step at a time," she said softly. "We'll get through this together." She helped him out of the car, and they walked toward the house. As they passed an open garage, Sam glanced inside and counted a Maserati, a Jaguar, and a Bentley among several other gleaming models she couldn't identify. "What does your sister do?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Entrepreneurship." They turned to see a woman in her early 30s standing confidently with her hands on her hips and a sly smile. "Although, if you want an official title, I'd say I'm the general director." For a few seconds, Ethan simply stared at her. She looked different from how he remembered, stronger, more confident. But beneath it all, he could still see the Valerie he knew. Sam nudged him gently. "Go on," she whispered. Ethan took a step forward. Physically, only a few feet separated him from his sister, but emotionally, the distance felt immense. Valerie waited patiently, her expression softening. Finally, he reached her. She looked up at him with her blue eyes, then suddenly threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Welcome back, Ethan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." After a moment, Valerie pulled back, her smile returning. "This is a pleasant surprise. You didn't say you were bringing anyone else." She glanced at Sam. "Aren't you going to introduce us?" "Yes, of course." Ethan cleared his throat. "Val, this is my friend Sam. Sam, this is my sister Valerie." "Nice to meet you," Sam said warmly, shaking Valerie's hand. "I'm sure Ethan has told you all about me," Valerie said with a playful grin. "Probably nothing good, right?" Sam joked, though she seemed a bit unsure. Valerie rolled her eyes and gave Ethan a light smack on the arm. "I remember you telling me every little detail about your dates with Zoya, but not a word about Sam." Ethan and Samantha froze at the mention of Zoya. Sensing the tension, Valerie quickly shifted gears. "Let's head inside," she said brightly. "I repainted the old house. It looks better now, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded. "So, you're the CEO?" Sam asked as they stepped inside. "What does your company do?" "Venture capital," Valerie replied. "Maybe you've heard of Cole and Greer PLC?" Sam's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Of course. It's impossible not to notice you in the Wall Street Journal." Valerie laughed. "Well, there you have it. But why live here and not in the city?" Sam asked, clearly fascinated. "Most of my work can be handled over the phone or via video conference. I have an office to monitor stocks if I need to, and I go to Manhattan occasionally to remind the board of directors that I'm still alive." A fresh breeze blew through the open windows, and Valerie closed her eyes for a moment, savoring it. "But there's something about this place you can't find in the concrete jungle. Some things are more important than money. I like living here." "Ethan told me you've done a lot for this city," Sam said. "This is my personal project," Valerie said proudly. "I invest in small businesses across the country, giving them the capital to grow. There are plenty of success stories here if you're interested." She owns a controlling interest in, well, almost every business in town, Ethan added with a wry smile. "Enough about me," Valerie said. "Let me introduce you to the rest of the family." "Ethan," a shrill voice called out from the doorway. A woman stepped outside, her face lit with recognition. "Sarah, I didn't recognize you for a second," Ethan exclaimed, pulling her into a warm hug. "Sam, meet Sarah Gardner. She lived across the street growing up." "You forgot to mention," Valerie chimed in, "that you were the only person she let into her treehouse." Sarah laughed, giving Valerie a quick peck on the cheek. "How long have you been married?" Sam asked. 5 years next month," Sarah replied with a beaming smile. "We even have a child now, through IVF." "Where's Colin?" Ethan asked. "Last time I checked," Sarah said, "we'll wake him up soon." "My God, I can't believe you're actually here, Ethan. I thought Val was joking when she said you were coming." They sat down in the cozy living room, and Valerie called for the maid to bring some snacks. "So, Sam, what do you do?" Sarah asked with genuine curiosity. "I'm a photographer," Sam replied. "Currently, I'm not collaborating with any specific magazine or publication." "Show them that magazine," Ethan teased with a chuckle. But Sam shot him a sharp look. and the idea quickly vanished from his mind. Do you live in the city too, Sam? Sarah continued. Yes, Sam said, smiling. Before she could elaborate, a rough voice came from the next room. Colin's about to wake up. The words trailed off mid-sentence. Ethan stood and turned toward the doorway, where the speaker had appeared, a man he hadn't seen in 10 years. His father. Arthur Cole's hair was almost entirely white now, but his skin remained as rugged as ever. Despite being over 60, he was still in shape, his massive figure blocking the doorway like a wall. I'll check on Colin, Sarah said quickly, disappearing from the room. I'll grab my things from the car, Sam began, sensing the tension, but Ethan held out a hand to stop her. Arthur's eyes flicked from Sam to Ethan before settling on his son. Arthur Cole, a lifelong Greenville police officer, had faced danger many times on duty. But never in his life had he felt as afraid as he did now, standing in front of his estranged son. Nice to see you, Ethan, Arthur said, his voice gravelly. It's been a long time. Ethan didn't reply. Arthur accepted his silence and nodded slowly. I understand. This is a lot to process. Take your time. When you're ready, we'll talk. I just want you to know that I'm ashamed of what I put you and your sister through. I'd give my life to undo the pain I caused. Ethan's mind raced with unspoken words. Memories of scars, bruises, cold nights on the veranda, and missed dinners. All the bitterness and anger welled up inside him. Sensing the tension, Valerie stepped in, taking Ethan's hand and gently guiding him toward their father. Ethan extended a cold, tense handshake. There was no hug, just a strained exchange. It wasn't much, but it was a start. You'll never guess where you're staying, Valerie announced with a bright smile as they drove through town. Where? Ethan asked. At the Woodford Inn, she said, pointing to a grand building on the outskirts of the city. Ethan stared in disbelief at the 19th century house, now transformed. It had been repainted, its windows replaced. The once dilapidated inn was unrecognizable. It can't be, Ethan said, astonished. The old Woodford Inn? No one stayed there in 40 years. Well, I own it now, Valerie replied with a grin. I restored it. It has everything, jacuzzis, 4-poster beds, a chef, a maid, the whole package. It's nothing like I remember, Ethan said, still amazed. Do you remember how much trouble we caused there as kids? Valerie laughed. Of course I do, Ethan said, a faint smile breaking through. Valerie wrapped an arm around his shoulders, leaning gently against him. Admit it, you've missed this city, even just a little. Standing at a distance, Sam snapped photos of the colonial-style building. If you don't mind my asking, Ethan, Valerie began, her tone softening. Are things serious between you two? She's a friend, Ethan said. She's helped me through a lot. That's where we are, where we're comfortable. Are you sure she sees it the same way? She came here with you. That says a lot. Ethan stopped and took Valerie's hand, pressing it to his chest. Valerie, you've always been straightforward, so I need to ask. How did you know Zoe and I wouldn't work out back then? You were both too young, Valerie said gently. You hadn't seen enough of the world to make a real commitment. That's the only reason I supported Dad back then. You were right, Ethan muttered, kicking a stone. No, I wasn't, Valerie said firmly. You had 10 wonderful years of marriage. Do you know how many people live their entire lives without experiencing that? Stop dwelling on what went wrong and be grateful for what you had later that evening. Ethan and Sam settled into the master bedroom at the inn. Ethan took a hot shower and shaved, emerging feeling lighter but still burdened. A small party was planned at Valerie's house that night, with half the town expected to come see the prodigal son return. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Valerie stood there with a basket of cupcakes in her hands. Just like old times, huh? She said with a grin. Exactly. Ethan agreed. Dad sends me to bed without dinner, and Mom sneaks me food while he's too drunk to notice. Valerie laughed, handing him the basket. These are from Andy's bakery down the street. Your favorite blueberry muffins. Ethan's eyes lit up. Sam, you have to try these. He bit into one and sighed. Exactly like I remember. They're complimentary for guests, Valerie teased. My brother gets the royal treatment around here. You can have whatever you want free of charge. I want to visit Andy's bakery later, Ethan said. You should, Valerie said. It's much bigger now. They get orders from all over the state. Weddings, conferences, you name it. You're kidding, Ethan said, amazed. That little candy store? Valerie grinned. I'm her silent partner. I'll order some of these cupcakes to New York, Sam blurted out. I'm having a party soon, and I'd love to serve them. Can you give me their business card? Speaking of parties, Valerie said, quickly changing the subject. We're late for one. It's time to go. Hurry up. Half an hour later, Sam and Ethan stood wide-eyed among a crowd of people eager to meet them. Ethan smiled and pretended to remember everyone who greeted him. Former classmates, friends, and neighbors swarmed around, excited to see him. Many were disappointed that he couldn't recall the smallest details of their shared past. Ethan had worked hard to distance himself from his old life, and it showed. After politely apologizing to a few more surprised faces, he excused himself and scanned the room, searching for Valerie or Samantha. He spotted his sister surrounded by a group of children, smiling as they leaned in close to the table. Curious, Ethan approached to see what was happening. Valerie was seated at the table, shuffling 3 cards quickly. Try to find a queen, she said, laying them face down in front of the kids. They watched her hands intently, their eyes wide with concentration, trying not to lose track of the card they wanted. When she finished shuffling, she leaned back and grinned. So, where's the lady? A quiet debate broke out among the children as they whispered and pointed, each guessing where the queen might be. Ethan chuckled softly and said, not in any of those cards. The lady is in your pocket. Hey, Valerie exclaimed, feigning irritation. You don't even play. It's not a game if no one can win. Ethan replied with a smirk. There's no money here, she countered, laughing. I do it for fun now. In high school, you made good money tricking naive tourists into falling for this, Ethan said, raising an eyebrow. We had to start somewhere, Valerie said with a shrug and a laugh. Come on, let me introduce you to my friends. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and saw Sam standing a few feet away, chatting with a group of young women. She had her camera out and was showing them its features, her enthusiasm evident. After an hour of mingling, Ethan grabbed a cold can of Budweiser and stepped out onto the porch. Arthur sat in a rocking chair nearby, holding a baby in his lap and a glass in his hand. Before you ask, this is fruit beer. No alcohol, Arthur said, noticing Ethan's glance. Well then, to your health, Ethan replied, sitting down next to him. They sat silently for a while, watching the party from a distance. Handsome little guy, huh? Arthur said, lifting the baby slightly. Ethan gently ran his hand over his nephew's soft head and nodded. You still haven't decided whether you're ready to accept my apology, have you? Arthur asked quietly. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he took a sip of his beer. That's okay, Arthur said after a pause. All I can hope for is that you will in time. My biggest regret is that your mother never got to see this side of me. She died knowing me only as the monster I was. Ethan exhaled sharply, but didn't reply. Arthur continued, I'm glad I changed my life. I really am. It took so much therapy to realize such a simple truth, that I was hurting the people I should have loved the most. So, are you a pacifist now? Ethan asked, a faint smile on his lips. Let's just say I won't let Valerie even put an electric insect trap in the garden, Arthur said, chuckling. Ethan laughed and took another sip. But don't think I've forgotten how to protect the people I love, Arthur added seriously. If anyone dares to touch you, your sister, Sarah, or little Colin, I swear on your mother's grave, I'll bring the full wrath of heaven down on them. You suffer for your family, not because of them. Arthur's raised voice startled Colin, who stirred in his sleep. Arthur immediately began rocking him gently until he settled again. Tell me about Sam, Arthur said softly. Does she make you happy? She does. Very much, Ethan admitted. Then that's enough for me, Arthur replied with a nod. I won't make the same mistake I made with you and Zoe. You have my blessing. As the party wound down, Samantha left a strong impression on everyone she met. Townspeople shook hands with her and Ethan, inviting them to dinners and gatherings. They smiled until their jaws ached. Finally, Valerie had her driver take them back to the Woodford Inn. Too exhausted to eat, they went straight to bed. Wake up, Ethan said, shaking Samantha gently. She wrinkled her nose without opening her eyes. It's not morning yet, she pulling the blanket over her head. But Ethan didn't relent. He pulled the blanket off her again, forcing her awake. Why won't you let me sleep? She muttered, glaring at him with a mixture of annoyance and exhaustion. I want to show you something, he said, a mischievous smile on his face. Sam sat up reluctantly, her curiosity slowly overtaking her fatigue. Ethan opened the window and climbed out onto the lower part of the roof, holding out his hand to her. Careful, he warned. Some shingles might be loose. After some effort, they both sat down side by side, looking out at the horizon. A faint red glow in the sky heralded the rising sun. Their view stretched into the distance, beautifully framed by two hills. Now you'll see the most beautiful thing in this city, Ethan said. He turned to look at Samantha, who had climbed back through the window a few minutes earlier. She returned shortly, holding her camera. Ethan, have you ever taken a selfie with a DSLR? Well, now we're going to have the highest quality selfie ever. They waited until the sun peaked above the horizon, a fiery semicircle veiled in wisps of clouds. The sun gradually broke through, illuminating the sky. The red glow on the horizon softened into a thin layer of purple haze that gracefully bridged night and day. Sam paused to admire the palette of colors before snapping a photo. She turned her back to the sun, extended the camera, and pointed the lens toward herself. Come here, Ethan. Before he could react, she kissed him on the cheek just as the camera clicked. Her assessment was spot on. The light from the rising sun softly illuminated their faces, and even the tiny space between them glowed with the sun's rays. This won't go on Instagram, she said with a satisfied smile. This is just for us. Ethan touched his cheek where her lips had brushed against him. When her lips met his skin, the sunrise suddenly felt like an afterthought. Ethan, are you listening? Samantha smiled. I asked if we should frame this. He didn't answer. Instead, his arm slipped around her shoulders, and he pulled her closer, pressing his lips against hers. The kiss was deep and tender, a spontaneous expression of everything he felt but hadn't dared to say. Samantha was so stunned by the unexpected gesture that she didn't react immediately. When their lips finally parted, her eyes were dazed, her gaze clouded. I'm sorry, Sam, Ethan whispered. I don't know what came over me. I shouldn't have done that. To hell with that, she replied, and kissed him again, more urgently this time. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. Their eyes closed as their lips moved together in perfect harmony, tongues dancing and exploring. When they broke apart again, they stared into each other's eyes for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. But not now, Samantha whispered. Ethan nodded, wrapping his arm around her shoulders again. Together, they watched the sunrise in silence. The next day passed in a whirlwind of laughter and vibrant moments. Finally, the time came for Ethan to leave. Before he departed, Valerie pulled him aside. This is my personal number, Ethan, she said, slipping him a piece of paper. Call me anytime, for any reason. Whatever you need, I'll do everything I can to help. No questions asked. Ethan hugged his sister tightly before getting into the car. Sam, sitting in the passenger seat, played with little Colin's fingers as he waved goodbye. Come again soon, Sarah shouted. You can be sure of that, Sam replied with a smile. As evening fell, they neared the city limits. Suddenly, Samantha veered off the road and drove onto a hill. Where are we going? Ethan asked. I want to take a couple of pictures, silly. I haven't practiced trick photography in a long time. Reluctantly, Ethan let her pull him out of the car and onto a large boulder. She directed him to extend his hand, then positioned her lens so that the setting sun appeared as a fireball in his palm. Next, she had him pose as if he were lifting a distant hill. When she suggested more poses, Ethan grumbled and retreated to the car. The air was alive with fireflies, their flickering lights reflecting the star-filled sky. The red hues of the setting sun slowly gave way to deep twilight, the crescent moon casting its dim glow. The tranquil sounds of returning birds and buzzing insects completed the mesmerizing scene. Ethan, however, paid no attention to the beauty around him. His eyes were fixed on Samantha as she photographed the landscape. She looked serene, her joy radiating in the soft evening light. He didn't know her full story, but from her parents' words at the party, Ethan suspected she had endured something deeply traumatic. His phone buzzed suddenly, breaking his thoughts. Frowning, he glanced at the screen. It was Samantha's father. "Mr. Pendry?" Ethan answered. "Is Samantha with you?" Mr. Pendry's voice was thick with anxiety. "Yes, she's here, taking photographs. Should I call her over?" "No, don't," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "I can't bring myself to talk to her right now. Ethan, I need to ask you to do something very difficult. I'm sorry to put this on you." "What's happened?" Ethan asked, his stomach tightening. There was a long pause. "Tell Sam." Mr. Pendry's voice cracked. "Tell her that her brother won't be coming home again." A choked sob followed, drowning out the rest of his words. Ethan's hand fell limp, and the phone slipped from his grip. He took a deep breath, letting out a long, heavy exhale. A memory of a party at her brother's house flashed through his mind. Ethan had never met James in person, but from conversations, he knew that James was deeply loved and would be greatly missed. Though Ethan didn't know him well, he understood that a huge void had now been left in the Pendergast family. "Ethan, one more shot, and we can head back to town." Sam called cheerfully from where she was snapping pictures. Her voice jolted him back to the present. He turned toward her. She looked so joyful and carefree, camera in hand, a wide smile lighting up her face. "Come on, Ethan. Don't be a bore." Ethan couldn't bring himself to look her in the eyes. Sam noticed his unease, lowering her camera and leaning toward the car to see him better. "What's happened?" she asked softly. The burden her father had placed on him weighed heavily on his shoulders. It felt cruel to ruin her happiness. He dreaded the moment her bright smile would give way to something heavier. Ethan quietly opened the car door and walked toward her, pulling her into a hug. With trembling hands, he cradled her face, closing his eyes. Ethan was not a religious man, but he prayed for strength. Strength to tell her the devastating truth. Strength to see his friend break under its weight. "A man went to war for his country," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "And all that's left of him now is a coffin wrapped in a flag. Some Ismail Tolted. Major James Pendergast was killed in action. The mission was a strategic success, saving countless lives, but that's little consolation to those left behind." Sam's wide eyes filled with tears as the words sank in. Her face twisted with pain, and she staggered back. Ethan held her tightly as sobs racked her body. At the funeral, Sam stood silently, watching as her brother's coffin was carried to its final resting place. All her life, she had dreaded this moment in her nightmares. Now, she couldn't wake up. Her tear-filled eyes darted to James' wife, Thea, who stood trembling, clutching a handkerchief to her face. The coffin was lowered into the grave as uniformed soldiers raised their guns in a solemn salute. "Mommy, why are they putting Daddy in the ground?" asked Lana, James' daughter, tugging on Thea's skirt. "They're burying him, dear," Thea replied, barely able to speak. "They can't bury him. He promised to protect us. Daddy promised he'd protect me." Thea bent down, scooping Lana into her arms as tears poured down her face. Holding her daughter tightly, she tried to find comfort in the embrace, though the hole in her heart felt impossible to fill. "Stop burying Daddy," Lana sobbed. "Tell them to stop. He promised he'd be at my birthday." Not a single person among the mourners had dry eyes. Friends and colleagues, many of them hardened soldiers, felt the chill of their own mortality. James' medals and awards, once symbols of valor, were now only bittersweet memories. Samantha stood slightly apart from the crowd, her heart bleeding. She wanted desperately to cry, to let the pain out, but she couldn't. Her family had already lost one pillar. She couldn't let them see another crumble. For the first time in her life, Samantha felt the overwhelming urge to let go, but she didn't. She forced herself to absorb the pain and stay strong for those around her. A gentle hand on her shoulder broke through her despair. Turning slowly, she saw Ethan standing beside her, offering a soft, understanding smile. The dam holding her emotions finally burst. Samantha grabbed his coat and buried her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. At that moment, Samantha realized she still had a shoulder to lean on. Despite her grief, she thanked the universe for this small mercy. It hadn't taken Ethan away from her, too. After the funeral, Ethan drove Samantha home. She clung to him the entire ride, crying quietly. He had never seen this side of her before, and it was excruciating. Her face, usually so full of life and joy, was streaked with tears and smudged mascara. Her chest rose and fell with the force of her sobs, some catching in her throat. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, holding her tightly. Samantha looked up at him, her eyes red and puffy, and managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Ethan." "You're welcome," he replied softly. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "I want you to know something about the night we kissed. Sam, you don't need to think about that now." Ethan interrupted gently. "We'll talk about it when you're ready." "You're so kind," she said with a small laugh, lightly punching his chest. "You've never tried to take advantage of me or put pressure on me. Do you know what my main principle in life is?" "What's that?" "I never wait. The only constant in life is change. Every day is a new adventure, a chance to meet new people and see new places. But over these past months, I've learned something important. There are people worth waiting for, and you're one of them." They pulled up to her house. Samantha got out, then turned back to him through the open car window. "When you're ready to take the next step," she said, her voice steady, "I'll be here, ready to take it with you." She leaned in and kissed him softly. Her lips left a warm, lingering memory on his skin. "See you soon, Ethan." He watched her slender figure disappear behind the door. He quietly ran a finger over his lips where hers had just been. In that brief moment when their lips touched, he felt like he could be whole again. Another day, another mountain of work. Life at the hospital was invariably predictable due to the volume of cases. Ethan scanned the papers in front of him, but couldn't bring himself to start. He paced back and forth in his office, trying to comprehend what Samantha had told him last night. He touched his lips, closing his eyes, remembering her kiss. Her scent, her touch, her look, all of it was forever imprinted in his memory. It was nectar, the residual taste of which he wanted to savor for a long time. When the day finally came to an end, Ethan got ready to go home. There was a burden in his head that he decided he needed to get rid of. Going down to the lobby, he saw a familiar face he didn't expect to see at all, Zoe. She looked considerably older after the events of recent months. She was wearing a simple dress and skirt with a coat. For a few seconds, she reminded him of the woman he had once come home to after a long day. "I came to say goodbye, Ethan," she said. "My cousin found me a job at a private practice in Hartford. It took me a long time to process this, but I made a decision. I need to get away from all of this. I need to start over in a place where I won't constantly remind myself of my mistakes." He smiled and put his hands on her shoulders. "I'm happy for you, really. I'm glad." This was the first time since the divorce that he had seen her face without a single trace of bruises. Zoe looked much better. "So, this really is the end?" "It was over a year ago," Zoe answered. "We just took too long to admit it." Ethan let go of her shoulders and put his hands in his pockets. "I have something for you." He took out a velvet box and handed it to Zoe. She opened it with curiosity and took out an elegant gold medallion with a clasp. "Open it," he said softly. She pressed a small button, and the locket opened. What she saw inside made her press her hand to her mouth, then to her heart, trying to suppress the surging emotions. On one side was a photo of her, taken in St. Catherine's Park, where she was illuminated by the rays of the sun. On the other side, Ethan's smile. "I ordered it for you more than a year ago," he explained. "In fact, I was going to give it to you the day I first saw you with Milos." "You kept it all this time?" Zoe asked, her voice breaking. "I tried to throw it away, really, but I couldn't. That being said, we lived 10 wonderful years together. I couldn't pretend they didn't happen." Zoe fastened the locket and rubbed it with her fingers. Her eyes dropped down, hiding her tears. "Zoe," he hugged her and pressed her against his shoulder. Their lips met in a short but tender farewell kiss. She wanted to remember this kiss, to keep it as a treasured memory for all the lonely nights in New England. Promise me one thing, Ethan, she said quietly. Will you promise? I promise. Promise me you'll tell the next woman you date that she's the luckiest girl in the world. And promise that you will love her the way you loved me. With those words, the woman who was once Zoe Morno-Cole walked away. Ethan watched her go until she disappeared into a taxi. That's it. The weight of hatred that had been weighing on his neck all this time had finally lifted. He took out his phone and dialed a number on speed dial. I'm ready. I'll come to you tonight. Later that night, Ethan walked into Samantha's apartment, not knowing what to expect. Scented candles were burning in the living room. Damon had just finished lighting the last one. You're lucky, he smiled at Ethan. I'm leaving. He left, making another joke about how he could use bisexuals. Ethan just shook his head in embarrassment. Come in, a voice came from her bedroom. Ethan opened the door and saw Samantha standing by the bed, completely without anything. The lights were dim, and a slow quartet tune played quietly in the background. He just stood there dumbfounded. Her eyes watched him, full of challenge, inviting him to take the next step. Come to me. She sat down on the bed and patted the spot next to her. Her gaze followed him from the door to the very edge of the bed. She took his hand. Talia told me that you can probably guess why I avoid relationships so much. You probably learned this at your birthday party, right? Ethan nodded. How much did they tell you? Enough to understand that it was something truly terrible. That's enough for me, she said, squeezing his hand tighter. Can you see me, Ethan? She whispered. I am without anything before you, in all my truth. I want you to know everything that happened before we take the next step. You don't have to tell me this, he said gently. I don't want you to go through this again. I want to, she answered firmly. It's not fair that everyone is moving forward, but I'm stuck in the worst moment of my life. Before this happened, I was the life of the party, and that's the kind of woman you deserve to be with. This will be the hardest thing I've ever done, but I want to tell you what happened to me. Ethan smiled at her and gently brushed a strand of her hair out of her face. I would be honored to hear this. Samantha smiled back at him and pressed her without closed body against his chest. Ethan put his arm around her, pressing her head against his shoulder as she began her story. It happened 3 years ago. I was in Barcelona visiting my artist friend. Oh God, you're going to propose to her, even while in Greenville? Valerie couldn't hide her delight. Yes, Ethan answered, sitting on the edge of the bed in Samantha's apartment. He looked back and saw her body curled up among the sheets. Her first intimate experience in many years had turned out to be a real masterpiece. Parts of his body that he didn't even know existed throbbed with pleasure. Have you already thought about how you're going to propose? His sister continued. Not yet. Don't worry, Valerie waved it off. I'll be in Manhattan next week, and I'll book you a table at Lurk. Leave everything to me, and I promise that she won't forget this evening. Will you have time? He asked. Don't you have a lot of work? Nonsense, Valerie said with a smile. I will always find time to help my brother. I will be very grateful. Wait, Sarah wants to talk to you. The next voice Ethan heard was Sarah's excited, high-pitched voice. Ethan, congratulations. When is the wedding? Where will the ceremony be? What will you name your children? Please name the girl Lily. I would love to spoil a niece named Lily Cole. Hey, you're getting too ahead of yourself. Ethan laughed. We haven't discussed such details yet. Sorry, I'm just so happy for you. I'll go get Arthur. Don't hang up. At the family home in Greenville, Sarah hurried through the house to hand the phone to Arthur. Valerie finished rocking the baby before picking up an old photograph, a snapshot of her, Ethan, and their mother when Valerie was 10 years old. She smiled, looking at her childish face as she hugged her little brother, as if protecting him. Mom made me promise that I would always take care of you, Valerie thought to herself. That was all he needed to know. She was right. There were things Ethan didn't need to know, like the fact that ever since Ethan called her, heartbroken after a night out, saying that his marriage was on the rocks, Valerie had been secretly gathering information about Zoe and the man she had betrayed him with. There was also the fact that over a year ago, Valerie made a strange business decision to sell the bulk of the shares her company held in a promising mining company. This triggered a panic sell-off that sent the company's shares plummeting to insignificance. And the fact that Milos Petric had invested millions in this company millions that disappeared overnight, leaving him in financial bankruptcy as deep as his moral decline. Truly, these were things Ethan didn't need to know. Subscribe to our channel so your love doesn't cheat on you. And listen to the next story, because this one is nothing compared to the next. If you're under 18, don't even think about moving on to the next.